Um, if you've glanced at your phone or, picked up a paper lately, you've probably seen this one specific date flashing basically everywhere.
Oh, yeah. Like a giant neon warning sign.
Exactly. April 10, 2026. I mean, the rumor mill is just going crazy. And honestly, even a lot of mainstream commentary is pointing to this exact Tuesday as the moment Britain supposedly runs out of oil.
Right, because of the ongoing conflict with the U.S., Israel, and Iran.
Yeah. So welcome to the deep dive. Today we are unpacking the actual reality behind that date because it's freaking a lot of people out.
For sure. And we're using a really detailed analysis from the Face blog. The author, Parmendra Kumar Phagat, basically argues that this whole April 10th doomsday thing is literally false.
Right, but economically it represents a very real, very dangerous turning point.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's being treated by the public as this apocalyptic cliff edge, right? People are imagining, I don't know, someone flipping a giant switch at midnight on April 9th.
And suddenly the pumps are dry, the planes are grounded.
Yeah, and the entire UK economy just grinds to a sudden halt. But the reality of global energy markets is, well, it's way more complex than that.
Which we're going to get into. But before we get into the mechanics of why that is, it's really important to state right up front, we are discussing an active, highly polarizing geopolitical conflict here.
Yeah, very much so.
So our goal today, our mission for this deep dive, is purely to unpack the economic analysis, the energy data, and the market arguments presented in the source.
Right. We are definitely not taking a political stance or endorsing any military viewpoint.
No, not at all. We're not taking sides. We are here strictly to understand the mechanics of this energy crisis and the shockwaves it's sending through the UK and the rest of the world.
The focus really has to be on the data, the physical reality of the supply chains.
Because the mission is to debunk this myth of the sudden empty fuel tank, but also simultaneously validate the profound economic squeeze that the UK is actually entering.
Right, we're shifting the focus from a sudden mechanical failure to a tightening economic and political vice.
A tightening vice. I like that. So to understand why Britain isn't going to just run dry overnight, we have to look at what actually broke in the system back on, what was it, February 28th?
Yeah, February 28th, that was the trigger.
Right, so following those airstrikes by the U.S. and Israel on Iranian targets, Iran retaliated.
But they didn't just fire back militarily, which is the key here. They used their geography.
They choked off the Strait of Hormuz.
Exactly. And that geographical, that is the absolute center of gravity for this entire global panic right now.
Because it's such a massive choke point.
Huge. The Strait of Hormuz is this incredibly narrow maritime artery right between the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman.
Like, how narrow are we talking?
At its narrowest point, the actual shipping lanes are only a couple of miles wide in each direction.
Wow.
Yeah. So it is incredibly vulnerable to disruption. And roughly 20% of the entire globe's oil flows through that specific tiny choke point.
20%, just passing through one narrow stretch of water.
Yeah, we are talking about 15 to 20 million barrels of crude oil and petroleum products moving through there every single day.
That is insane. And not to mention a massive portion of the world's liquefied natural gas, too, LNG.
Right. So when an artery like that constricts, the global market doesn't just experience, a minor supply hiccup.
It goes into cardiac arrest.
Basically, yeah. Which obviously forces a military response, but crucially a very carefully calibrated one from the UK.
Right. The UK's posture has been strictly defensive. I mean, the Prime Minister has maintained that, quote, this is not Britain's war, while still committing to defend allies.
Exactly. So we see the RAF, the Royal Air Force, conducting interceptions.
And the UK has permitted U.S. forces access to its bases.
Yeah, and the Royal Navy deployed a destroyer, the HMS Dragon, down to the region. But it's a defensive shield.
Which makes sense politically. The electorate back home is clearly much more willing to support a defensive posture than, an open-ended military escalation.
Oh, totally. But the thing is, the global economic shockwave, it does not care if a navy is playing defense or offense.
Right. A block straight is a block straight.
Exactly. And this highlights a really vital distinction that the source brings up between an embargo and a blockade.
Because we kind of use those interchangeably in casual conversation.
All the time. But economically and diplomatically, they are vastly different animals.
Okay, so break that down for us. What's the difference?
Well, an embargo is a political choice. So think back to the 1973 oil crisis.
Right.
The Arab members of OPEC deliberately chose to stop selling oil to nations that supported Israel. It was a policy decision.
So because it was just a policy, it could be reversed with a diplomatic agreement.
Exactly. A politician can step up to a podium, hold a press conference, shake some hands, and turn the taps back on.
But a blockade is different.
Very. A blockade is a physical casualty of war. The pipe itself has been shattered, essentially.
So you can't just end a physical blockade with a press conference.
No, not at all. It requires immense military de-escalation, a really complex negotiated settlement, or the forceful, prolonged restoration of maritime security.
Because it's literally physically unsafe to go there.
Right. The physical denial of an area means insurance companies simply will not cover oil tankers trying to transit the strait.
Oh, wow. I didn't even think about the insurance side of it.
Yeah. I mean, even if a tanker wanted to run the gauntlet, the maritime insurance premiums would be astronomical. It makes the voyage totally economically unviable.
So that physical reality on the water instantly rewrites the global pricing map.
Instantaneously.
Which brings it directly back to the listener's wallet, right?
Oh, yeah.
Because when you hear that shipping routes are blocked thousands of miles away, it feels somewhat abstract, like, oh, that's bad news over there.
But then a few days later, you pull up to the petrol station to commute to work, and the price on the sign just makes your jaw drop.
Exactly. So a good way to think about it, think of global oil as this massive town reservoir.
Okay, I like this analogy.
Right, so Iran didn't cut the specific pipe going directly to the UK's house. They blocked the main river feeding the entire town reservoir.
Yes. So suddenly, everyone in town is scrambling for a much smaller amount of water in that central pool.
And the energy shock was, immediate and highly visible on the trading floors.
Oh, absolutely. Brent crude, which, that serves as the major global benchmark for pricing oil, it surged sharply.
It touched near, what, $120 a barrel?
Yeah, near 120 before finally stabilizing at those elevated levels.
And that translates immediately to the consumer. UK petrol and diesel prices rose roughly 20 to 40 pence per liter almost overnight.
And wholesale gas prices spiked even more severely. And then, of course, human psychology takes the wheel.
Right, because the UK government came out and insisted there was no national fuel shortage.
And structurally, the numbers actually backed them up.
They did.
Yeah.
But localized shortages started popping up across the country anyway.
Yeah, panic buying. It's a classic phenomenon in supply chain disruptions.
We saw it during the pandemic.
Exactly. We don't see a lack of physical supply arising at the borders, but we see these massive, unpredictable demand spikes at the local retail level.
People see the news, they feel anxious, and they rush out to top off their tanks.
Even if they only need a few liters, they start hoarding fuel in jerry cans in their garage.
Right. Think back to any time you've witnessed panic buying, whether it was during a severe winter storm or the early days of lockdown.
Toilet paper, anyone.
Exactly. You see a shelf half empty, and your brain just goes into survival mode. You buy 3 instead of 1.
And that collective hoarding mentality creates the exact physical shortage that the public is terrified of in the first place.
We manifest the crisis at the local level.
We really do. The psychological drive to secure resources completely overrides official reassurances.
So the UK is currently experiencing all these classic early symptoms of an oil shock.
Yeah, price spikes, deep public anxiety, the hoarding behavior, and rising political anger.
But experiencing an oil shock is fundamentally different from the country actually running out of physical fuel.
Completely different.
But hold on, though. I want to push back on this a bit. Because the UK actually has highly diversified oil sourcing, right?
Yes, very diversified.
Britain gets a massive portion of its oil and gas from Norway, which is right next door via the North Sea pipelines.
Right.
And heavily from the U.S. as well.
Right.
So the UK is not uniquely directly dependent on the Gulf for its baseline crude supply.
That's correct.
So if Britain buys its oil from Norway and America, why on earth are British drivers paying the price for a Middle Eastern blockade? I know you explained the reservoir analogy, but let's dig into the actual market mechanics of that.
Right, okay. So oil is a globally priced, highly fungible commodity.
Fungible
Meaning a barrel of oil is generally interchangeable with another barrel of oil, regardless of where it actually came from.
Okay.
So the UK isn't being cut off from Gulf oil physically, it's being priced out.
Ah, priced out.
Yeah. When 20% of the global supply gets trapped behind the Strait of Hormuz, the countries that heavily rely on the Gulf, like a lot of massive Asian economies, suddenly have a huge deficit.
Right. They still need oil to keep their countries running.
Exactly. So they have to look elsewhere. They look to Norway. They look to the U.S.
So the whole world is suddenly crowding into the exact same marketplace, waving cash, trying to bid on whatever non-Gulf oil is left.
Precisely. Everyone is competing for fewer overall barrels. So the UK is forced to buy its oil in an overheated, panicked global marketplace.
Even if the physical ship bringing oil to the UK originates in Norway.
Right. The price tag attached to that Norwegian oil is dictated by the global scarcity caused by the panic in the Middle East. The Norwegian seller is obviously going to charge the global market rate.
They're not going to give the UK a discount just because they're neighbors.
Definitely not.
Okay, so if the supply lines from Norway and the US are still completely open, and Britain is essentially just paying more for the oil, where did this terrifying April 10 doomsday narrative even come from?
Yeah, that date.
Why target that specific date if we're not actually running out?
Well, it stems from a very real, widely reported shipping pipeline model, mostly attributed to analyses by firms like J.P. Morgan.
Okay.
And the logic is really rooted in the harsh physical logistics of maritime shipping.
How so?
Okay, so the blockade of Hormuz began on February 28th, right?
Right.
But on February 27th and the weeks prior to that, oil tankers had already passed through the strait.
Oh, I see. They had left port and were out on the open ocean before the disruption even started.
Exactly. And it takes weeks for those very large crude carrier, VLCCs they call them. It takes weeks for them to make the journey from the Persian Gulf all the way to European ports.
Depending on the routes they take, yeah.
Right. So the shipping models simply track those in-transit shipments. And by around April 10th, the very last of those pre-war tankers...
The ones that cleared the strait just before the door slammed shut?
Yes. Those are going to finish arriving and offloading in Europe around April 10th.
So April 10th isn't the day the oil runs out. It is the day the pre-war oil stops arriving.
Exactly. It marks the end of the pre-crisis pipeline. The oil that was already on the water, already extracted and paid for that, is fully delivered.
And after that, we're in the new reality.
Right. But this absolutely does not mean Britain runs dry on April 11th. Not at all.
Because Britain has a formidable cushion built into its infrastructure, specifically for scenarios exactly like this.
A massive cushion.
Yeah, the numbers totally validate that. Let me grab the stats from the source. As of mid-March 2026, the UK held total oil stockpiles of approximately 76.6 million barrels.
Which is a lot.
It's a huge amount. To put that into perspective for you listening, normal UK daily demand is about 1.5 million barrels a day.
So if you do the math on that...
That gives them roughly 51 days of cover.
Oh.
And that is assuming they changed absolutely nothing about their consumption habits and didn't import a single new drop of oil from anywhere.
Right, which would never happen. They'd still be getting Norwegian and U.S. imports. But even more importantly, that 51 days of cover is just the visible sovereign safety net for the UK itself.
There's a bigger one.
Oh, yeah. The broader defense mechanism is the International Energy Agency, the IEA.
Oh, okay.
Under IEA rules, member nations are strictly required to hold emergency reserves equivalent to 90 days of their net imports.
Wow. 90 days.
Yeah, it is a massive, globally coordinated shield.
And we saw them use it, right?
Yeah.
On March 11th, the source notes the IEA announced its largest ever coordinated drawdown.
Yeah, I did.
Around 400 million barrels of oil were authorized for release across 32 member countries.
And the UK's contribution to that release was about 13.5 million barrels.
This is an orchestrated flooding of the market with stored energy.
Exactly. It's designed specifically to calm the panic and bridge the gap while the market adjusts.
So really, the April 10th date is not a cliff?
No, not a cliff at all.
It's more like riding a bicycle.
Okay, lay it on me.
It's not the day the wheels fall off the bike. It's the day you stop coasting on a nice, flat, newly paved road and you hit a massive steep hill.
Yeah, I like that.
You still have the bike, you can still pedal, but you don't have that easy momentum anymore, and it is going to demand a lot more energy and cause a lot more pain in your legs to keep moving forward.
That is a perfect way to describe it. April 10th is the day the global energy system stops coasting on pre-war momentum and starts paying the full, unmitigated price of the crisis.
The hill gets steep.
Very steep. After those pre-war shipments end, Europe has to transition entirely to alternative, often way more expensive suppliers.
Like where?
Scaling up imports from West Africa, Latin America, or paying massive premiums to divert cargoes from other regions that were meant for someone else.
Right.
And they have to rely heavily on those strategic reserve releases we just talked about.
Yep.
And most importantly, they have to rely on demand suppression.
Demand suppression, which is basically just economists speak for actively doing things to burn less fuel.
Exactly. Slower freight trains, industrial operations throttling down their output.
And ordinary citizens simply driving less because a tank of petrol costs a small fortune?
Right? This transition period is incredibly painful for the economy, but it is manageable because the international system, the IEA, the strategic reserves, it's working exactly as it was designed to function.
Which is such a crucial point.
Hmm.
And the reason that system was designed in the first place brings us to the historical ghost that is just haunting this entire crisis.
Oh, yeah. You can't talk about an oil shock without talking about this.
Whenever global energy markets detonate because of Middle Eastern geopolitics, everyone immediately reaches for the exact same historical parallel, 1973.
Yep, the 73 oil shock.
So the big question
Yeah.
is 2026 just a devastating rerun of 1973?
Well, let's look at the raw scale first, because the contrast between the two is staggering.
Okay.
In 1973, the Arab oil embargo removed about 4.5 million barrels of oil a day from the global market.
4.5 million.
Right. And at the time, that represented roughly 7 to 9% of total global supply.
Okay, got it.
Now, jump to 2026. The physical blockade of Hormuz has trapped approximately 20 million barrels a day.
20 million.
Yeah. The sheer volume of disrupted oil in 2026 is 4 times larger than the disruption that caused the catastrophic 1973 shock.
So on paper, a sudden supply loss of 20 million barrels a day should trigger a complete global economic heart attack.
Total system failure.
Yet despite the 2026 disruption being 4 times larger, the price of oil hasn't quadrupled the way it did in 1973.
No, it hasn't. In 73, prices exploded from about $3 a barrel to roughly $12 a barrel, virtually overnight.
Which shattered economies.
Completely.
But in 2026, as we said, Brent crude spiked to 120, but then it stabilized. It didn't shoot up to $300 or $400 a barrel, which is what a direct mathematical multiplier of the 73 shock might suggest.
Right.
So I have to ask, if this current disruption is 4 times larger than 1973, why isn't society collapsing 4 times as fast? What makes us better armored today?
That is the million-dollar question. And the answer is that the economic and physical infrastructure of the world has evolved dramatically since then.
Okay, how so?
Well, think about Britain in 1973. It was incredibly brittle. Britain had essentially no domestic North Sea oil production online yet.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and they had absolutely no strategic reserves to fall back on. They were completely exposed to the whims of the international market.
And the domestic situation in the UK was already pretty precarious then too, right?
Oh, it was a mess. The coal miners were striking, which crippled the domestic energy supply just as the international oil supply dried up.
The perfect storm.
Exactly. The result was the infamous 3-day week. The government mandated that commercial consumption of electricity be limited to 3 consecutive days.
I remember reading about that. Television broadcasts were forced to end early just to save power.
Yeah, speed limits were slashed. There were car-free Sundays across Europe. The sheer economic misery quite literally brought down Prime Minister Edward Heath's government.
It was a collective trauma.
It really was. It left a permanent scar on the British political and economic psyche.
So the 2026 world is fundamentally different because we learned from that trauma.
Exactly. The massive 2026 pileup has airbags that simply didn't exist in 1973.
Right.
The IEA and the whole concept of mandated strategic petroleum reserves, those were created specifically because of the 1973 shock.
We basically built a massive global shock absorber.
We did. But it's not just about storing millions of barrels of oil in salt caverns either.
What else is it?
The entire modern economy is less energy intensive per dollar of GDP generated today.
Ah, we're more efficient.
Way more efficient. And markets are highly flexible, globally integrated, and far more transparent.
Plus, we possess modern demand management tools that governments in 1973 couldn't have even conceptualized.
Yes. Consider the ability to instantly shift millions of workers to remote work.
Oh, that's a great point. In 1973, if you couldn't commute, the office simply ceased to function.
Right. Today, a government mandate to work from home saves millions of gallons of commuting fuel instantly with only a marginal drop in white-collar productivity.
That's huge. And what about logistics?
Digital logistics allow massive freight companies to optimize their routing in real time, shaving off tons of fuel consumption.
And the central banks operate completely differently now, too, don't they?
Entirely differently. In the 1970s, central banks struggled to really understand supply-side inflation. They often let wage price spirals run totally out of control.
But today,
Today, institutions like the Bank of England have the tools and the historical mandate to aggressively maneuver interest rates to prevent that kind of runaway hyperinflation.
even if raising rates causes immense friction in the housing and business sectors.
Right. It's a trade-off they're willing to make now. So the contrast is really stark. 1973 was a famine. You simply could not get the energy you needed.
And 2026.
2026 is rationing under pressure. The energy is there, but the price is incredibly harsh. It's deeply destabilizing. It eats into household budgets, but structurally, it is survivable.
Okay, so we have airbags for the oil market. We have the strategic stockpiles, the IEA releases, remote work capabilities, and flexible central banks.
We do.
But the source material points out that beneath the surface of this whole petrol panic, the UK has a gaping hole in its armor somewhere else entirely.
Yeah, a massive vulnerability.
Because while everyone is obsessing over the cost of filling up their car, the true profound vulnerability for Britain lies in natural gas.
Natural gas is the Achilles heel of the British energy system, without a doubt.
The source notes that the UK has notoriously limited gas storage capacity, like shockingly low when you compare it to neighboring countries in continental Europe like France or Germany.
It is shockingly low. Historically, the UK relied on continuously pumping gas straight out of the North Sea. They essentially treated the sea itself as their storage facility.
Just take it as you need it.
Right. But as those domestic reserves depleted over the years, the UK decommissioned major storage sites, like the Rough facility, and they never fully replaced that buffer.
So they're basically flying without a net when it comes to gas.
Pretty much. And the disparity in public visibility between oil and gas is just fascinating to watch.
What do you mean?
Well, when the price of petrol goes up, every single driver sees it illuminated on massive signs on their daily commute, right?
Yeah. It's an unavoidable, constant reminder of the geopolitical crisis.
But natural gas operates completely invisibly in the background. The average consumer rarely thinks about it until the monthly utility bill arrives.
Or at a worst-case scenario, until the lights go out.
Exactly.
I want to build out a biological analogy from the text because I think it helps visualize this perfectly.
Go for it.
If oil is the bloodstream of the economy, the liquid keeping the muscles moving, getting cars down the road, keeping the diesel cargo ships sailing and the supply chains flowing,
Right.
then gas is the central nervous system. A shock to the bloodstream, an oil spike, makes everything sluggish, painful, and very expensive. But a shock to the nervous system.
That paralyzes the entire grid.
Exactly.
Because gas is not just about turning on the boiler to heat your home during the winter. I mean, domestic heating is a massive draw on the system, sure.
But it goes way deeper than that.
So much deeper. Natural gas underpins the entire structural foundation of a modern industrial economy. It is deeply embedded in electricity generation, heavy industrial output, chemical production.
Like, if you're listening right now, just look around the room you're sitting in. Look at the lights overhead. Look at the device you are using to listen to this.
Think about the food sitting in your refrigerator.
Right. A huge portion of the UK's electricity grid relies on gas-fired power stations to provide baseload power and act as peaker plants when demand surges.
And that food in the fridge. It was likely grown using fertilizers produced via the Haber-Bosch process, which requires massive, massive amounts of natural gas.
And then it was transported in diesel trucks and stored in electric refrigerators powered by gas.
Yep. So a severe gas shortage wouldn't just mean throwing on an extra jumper because the heating bill is too high.
It's way more catastrophic than that.
Oh, yeah. If gas supplies drop below critical thresholds, heavy industries like manufacturing plants, chemical refiners, glass makers, they might literally be forced to shut down operations entirely.
Because they just won't be able to afford the exorbitant energy costs to run their machinery.
That, or the government will step in and mandate that industrial gas supplies be diverted strictly to keep households from freezing and the electrical grid from blacking out.
Wow. So if fertilizer production halts because there isn't enough gas to run the plants, that hits agricultural yields directly.
Which means food prices skyrocket even further.
The domino effect of a gas shock is genuinely terrifying.
It is.
And our dependence on it is completely woven into the fabric of modern life,
Yeah.
far more precariously than the highly visible petrol station down the street.
Which brings us to the ultimate thesis of the source material, because this profound underlying fragility leads to the real clock ticking down on this crisis.
Right, because a true ticking clock isn't mechanical.
Not at all.
Wars do not end simply because fighter jets literally run out of fuel. I mean, the UK military's current defensive posture, the air interceptions by the RAF, the naval presence in the Red Sea and the Gulf.
They have their own dedicated, highly secure supply chains.
Exactly. There is no evidence whatsoever that the military is facing an imminent risk of fuel exhaustion. The Royal Navy is not going to suddenly drop anchor because the petrol stations in London are running dry.
No, the military apparatus is incredibly well insulated from the immediate retail shortages.
So if the military can keep flying, what's the actual timer?
The true timer is domestic economics.
Okay, unpack that.
The war has effectively become a slow-moving, inescapable, invisible tax on absolutely everything.
The cascading effects.
Right. The inflated gas and oil prices act as this heavy tax on food production, manufacturing, logistics, retail supply chains, and basic household survival.
It inflates everything simultaneously, and the geopolitical shock pushes the economy toward a very specific, very nasty condition, doesn't it?
Yeah, stagflation.
Stagflation. The absolute nightmare scenario for central bankers and incumbent politicians.
It's the worst of both worlds. It is a toxic blend of high inflation, where prices for everyday goods and services are relentlessly going up, combined with a stagnant economy.
Meaning economic growth stalls out.
Exactly. Corporate hiring freezes, wages fail to keep pace with the cost of living, and unemployment begins to creep upward.
So you are paying significantly more just to survive, but your income isn't growing at all, and your job security is actively weakening.
It erodes the standard of living with brutal efficiency.
And the source points out that institutions like the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and the OECD have consistently warned about this.
Yeah, they've warned that Britain is uniquely vulnerable to this specific kind of shock due to its heavy reliance on imported gas and its broader economic structure.
So the timer transitions from being purely economic to intensely political.
That's the real breaking point. A government might have strategic petroleum reserves, but it does not have strategic reserves of public patience.
Wow, that's a great way to put it. Energy inflation is just relentless.
Every single time a citizen goes to the grocery store or pays a utility bill, the government bleeds political support.
So if the military can keep flying, how long can the government keep justifying the war to a public whose grocery bills are skyrocketing? When does defense become politically unaffordable?
Well, if the Strait of Hormuz remains physically blocked, the UK does not face a sudden cinematic collapse. Instead, it faces a grinding, agonizing deterioration.
Like what?
A weaker currency as investors lose confidence, rising industrial stress as factories struggle to pay power bills, and soaring public anger.
Which naturally breeds populism and intense political fracturing.
Naturally. When people feel their standard of living plummeting rapidly and they perceive that their government is prioritizing a distant geopolitical conflict over domestic economic survival.
The political pressure becomes explosive.
It really does. The diplomatic pressure on the government to de-escalate, to find literally any way out of the crisis, becomes overwhelming. Britain is basically running out of room to absorb pain.
It is a tightening vice. Every week the strait remains closed. Every week the prices stay high. The vice gets another brutal turn.
Yeah.
So the mechanical timer of April 10th is a myth, but the political timer is incredibly real.
And the thing about the political timer is it doesn't have a neatly circled date on a calendar.
Right, it's not like April 10th.
No, it simply has a breaking point. A moment where the domestic cost of sustaining the geopolitical posture becomes entirely unsustainable for whoever is in power.
Okay, so while the short term looks like this painful tightening vice, the source does note that this intense pressure might actually permanently forge a new energy landscape.
Yes, there are silver linings here. As hard as they are to see in the moment, there's an accelerated shift into the future happening right now.
Because just like 1973 forced the West to rethink energy dependence.
Right. We can look at that crucial historical parallel again. The '73 oil shock was devastating, but it forced the Western world to fundamentally rethink its relationship with energy.
It led directly to the creation of the IEA.
And it drove the automotive industry to design significantly more fuel-efficient cars. And it sparked a massive state-backed push for nuclear energy in countries like France, which completely transformed their power grid.
Right. So the 2026 crisis is positioned to permanently alter our current energy landscape in a similar but even more accelerated fashion.
Exactly. This crisis is pouring rocket fuel on specific energy transitions.
We are looking at massive, structurally incentivized boosts in electric vehicle adoption.
Skyrocketing demand for domestic heat pumps to replace those gas boilers.
A serious, well-funded reconsideration of nuclear power deployment.
Massive investments in utility-scale grid storage batteries. and a desperate rush toward the electrification of heavy industry.
The green transition is no longer just a long-term environmental goal. The timeline has violently compressed.
It's compressed out of pure necessity.
But I want to push back on this a little bit because it sounds incredibly optimistic to point to EVs and heat pumps as the silver lining here. Overhauling a national electrical grid, upgrading local distribution networks to handle millions of car chargers, and retrofitting millions of homes with heat pumps. That is a massive, decade-long infrastructure project.
Oh, easily a decade.
So how does the promise of a fully electrified grid in 2035 help the listener who is struggling to afford a 40 pence per liter hike at the petrol pump today?
It doesn't.
It doesn't.
No. The short-term pain is entirely locked in. There is no green technology that can be deployed fast enough to rescue the UK economy by this summer.
So what's the significance then?
The significance lies in a profound structural shift in capital. We are talking about where the major institutional money is directing its investments for the next 20 years.
Okay. Follow the money.
Always. Before this crisis, the transition to renewables was largely driven by environmental policy, government subsidies, and long-term climate goals.
Right, which can be politically fragile.
But the 2026 blockade of Hormuz has fundamentally changed the underlying financial calculus. Extreme geopolitical risk has now been permanently priced into fossil fuels.
Meaning they're not just seen as bad for the environment anymore.
Right. Oil and gas are no longer just viewed through an environmental lens. They are now categorized as mathematically risky investments because a regional war can shut down the supply chains literally overnight.
Wow. That's a huge paradigm shift.
It's massive. The 2026 crisis acts as the ultimate catalyst. It transforms the green energy transition from a polarized environmental debate into an urgent, unassailable matter of supreme national security.
Because when a country fully realizes that relying on imported natural gas means an adversary halfway across the world can paralyze its electricity grid and shut down its factories.
Shifting to domestic renewables, nuclear power, and grid storage becomes the ultimate defense priority.
Capital is flooding into these technologies at an unprecedented rate because relying on fossil fuel imports is now seen as an unacceptable strategic vulnerability.
Exactly. And historically, nothing accelerates human innovation and massive infrastructure deployment quite like a perceived existential threat.
The friction we are experiencing now is basically the cost of that acceleration.
Unfortunate, but true.
Okay, let's recap this journey because we've covered a huge amount of ground today.
We really have.
So, April 10th, 2026 is not a doomsday. It is simply the day the last pre-war shipments of oil finish arriving in Europe.
Right. And because of the brutal lessons learned from 1973, Britain is not defenseless.
Through the coordinated efforts of the IEA and massive modern stockpiles, the UK has a significant cushion to absorb the initial violent blow of the market shock.
But the physical blockade of the Strait of Hormuz has disrupted 20% of global oil.
Britain is not cut off from supply, but it is being aggressively priced out in a panicked, fungible global market.
And lurking beneath that highly visible oil panic lies the true vulnerability: natural gas. The central nervous system of the UK economy, exposed by shockingly low storage reserves.
Which means the real clock ticking down on this geopolitical standoff isn't a mechanical fuel gauge on a fighter jet.
No, the government's political capital is what is truly draining away.
The relentless, grinding economic pain of stagflation, of skyrocketing food and heating costs, is the tightening vice that will ultimately dictate how and when this conflict ends.
The 2026 shock is larger than 1973, and we are better armored, but the political combustion is inevitable if the economic pressure isn't released.
So as we wrap up, I want to leave the listener with something to really think about. We panic over these artificial deadlines like April 10 because a hard stop is easier to comprehend.
Yeah, an empty tank, a sudden blackout. It's a binary outcome. It's something the human brain can easily grasp.
But a slow, grinding, agonizing decline in our standard of living is much harder to process psychologically, even though it is far more dangerous.
It's the boiling frog analogy.
Exactly. But as this crisis aggressively accelerates our push toward a post-fossil fuel world driven entirely by the imperatives of national security, we have to confront a difficult reality. In the decades to come, the true limit of our global economy may not be the physical natural resources we can extract from the earth. The ultimate limit might simply be our psychological and political capacity to endure the immense societal friction of transitioning away from them.
That is a fascinating point.
And one more thing to mull over. We've spent this entire deep dive focused on the UK, a massive, wealthy economy with a 76 million barrel safety net, backed by the global power of the IEA.
Right.
And even with all of that armor, the UK is feeling immense destabilizing pain.
Oh, for sure.
So what happens to the developing nations? What happens to the emerging economies that don't have massive strategic reserves or the purchasing power to simply outbid Europe for Norwegian oil?
That is the invisible catastrophe hiding behind the Western headlines.
Millions of people priced out of basic energy survival entirely. That is something to mull over the next time you look at the price on the pump.